Hello and welcome to an essay plan that is going to compare Storm on the Island to Extract from the Prelude, Stealing a Boat. There's lots of videos out there that will show you how you can analyse each of these poems in isolation, which is important, but this video I hope is going to be useful to show you how to compare them both effectively. That is what the examiner wants. Okay, so let's presume that you are in the exam, you have opened up the paper, and what is written at the top is the question that you've now got to write an essay on. How is the power of nature presented in Storm on the Island and one other poem? What we're going to go through now, as usual, are a number of what I hope are really good comparative sentence starters for a number of paragraphs. The first one. Whereas in Storm on the Island, a semantic field of military language appears to almost physically kill the speaker, in the Prelude, nature is personified as a force that mentally kills the speaker. So that's a big sentence starter with a lot going on in it, and you can probably divide that up into two separate paragraphs. But effectively, what I'm saying here is that in Storm on the Island, he is physically affected by the weather, whereas in Extract from the Prelude, he is mentally affected. And there are different types of language used to create those two related but slightly different points. So I'd write that out and then I'd get into my detailed evidence to support this topic sentence from Storm on the Island, a semantic field of military language. I'd be analysing the use of the verb bombarded to imply intense, prolonged effects. I'd be analysing the idea that space is a salvo and the fact that salvo is a battlefield. I'd be talking about the sharp, quick, rapid, dynamic and quite lethal movement of the wind and how it dives and strafes. I'd be analysing those two verbs. And of course, I'd be talking about the idea of the weather exploding comfortably. And the idea, obviously, with the use of the verb exploding to suggest a large, devastating, permanent act of violence. All of these things I'm suggesting everybody can physically affect the people on the island, and they generally together could be called a semantic field of military language. I would then say this is in slight contrast to the Prelude, where they're not so much physically killed, but mentally killed. And it's not a semantic field of military language in the Prelude that conveys much of this. It is, in fact, personification. And there's so much personification of the weather in the natural world in the Prelude. I'm not quite sure where to start, but we will start here. The use of the verb upreared to describe the mountain implies a very steady, strong lifting of the top of the mountain's head. The fact that it towered up between me and the stars implies, obviously, an enormous tower-like being that is so enormous it is intimidating and overbearing. The fact that this mountain then strode after me, the use of the verb strode implying purposeful, uninhibited movement. All of these things I'm suggesting are personification, and they don't necessarily physically affect or seek to physically kill in the same way that verbs such as bombarded and exploding do in Storm of the Island, but they certainly mentally kill him by the end. I think that that's a perfectly acceptable thing to write, because we understand that his mind ends up with a blank desertion. So having had this personified natural force, which one would think would rather occupy the mind of the protagonist, now this mind, which was full of so much emotion and reaction to the mountain, is now nothing but a desertion. And of course we hear how it is a trouble to my dreams. The oxymoron here implying internal conflict. So that's a long, meaty paragraph, everybody, but I hope it's quite a good one, and you can analyse each of those bits of language in isolation, talk about their effects, and talk about how they're subtly different from each other, and I think you'd get pretty good marks with that. Sentence starter number 2. Whereas in Storm on the Island, oxymorons indicate a complex relationship with nature, in Stealing the Boat, Extract from the Prelude, hereafter referred to as the Prelude, A contrast of positive and negative language is presented, implying a good relationship with nature that turns sour. What do I mean by that, everybody? Well, there are lots of oxymorons running through Storm on the Island. Oxymorons, as we should know by now, are sharp, sudden differences of two words that are placed next to each other. There are many written out there. That I'm suggesting is quite a complex piece of language to handle, having oxymorons running all the way through the poem. The prelude is structured slightly differently, where we have good, positive language at the beginning and then negative, bad language at the end of the poem. So not so much oxymorons, but a division between good in the first half and bad in the second. And so those two ideas are certainly related and capable of being compared and contrasted, I should say. But you notice the subtle difference. Oxymorons running through the first poem, good then bad in the second poem to talk about today. So these oxymorons, they are all listed there: exploding comfortably, tragic chorus, tame cat turned savage, effectively that's an oxymoron, I think. Space is a salvo, huge nothing. These run all the way through the poem. They therefore suggest that he has a complex relationship with the natural world, because oxymorons are complex conceits. They are complex sentence structures, going from one extreme very suddenly to another. This, I'm suggesting, is slightly different to the prelude, where in the first, certainly before line 20, you look at the adjective, or the adverb, I should say, lustily. That suggests he's really enjoying what he's doing. The adjective proud of his skill. The fact that the water is glittering and sparkling suggests high value. He's really doing something that he thinks is rare and of, absolutely high value. All sounds good. That, though, completely is different to when the mountain appears in his vision. And we get the violent verbs, I struck and struck again, and that repetition along with that violent verb struck implies that the goodness of the first third of the poem or so has now gone. We also hear how he had trembling oars. You could analyse the verb trembling. The connotations of the verb trembling imply that he's enormously afraid, of course. So hopefully you see the subtle difference between the two there. They both have, to put it quite crudely and quite simply, they both have opposites in their poem, but the oxymorons of Storm on the Island run throughout the poem. There's a complexity there that is never resolved. That's slightly different from the prelude, which has lots of positive language in the first half of the poem, lots of negative, scary language, as it were, after that. Sentence starter number 3, and if you've had the opportunity to watch a few of the other videos, you'll see that I'm slightly repeating the same ideas here that I've used with other poems, but of course that's absolutely fine, and I'd certainly encourage you to do that. Whereas in Storm of the Island, the reader realises the speaker's misplaced confidence. In the prelude, the reader feels justice at the lack of respect for nature, or the power of nature, I should say, in order to really solidly link that back to the question. What I mean by this, everybody, is that we come to realise that the protagonist of Storm on the Island is a little bit too confident, but we're rather chuffed and rather pleased to see poor old Wordsworth get what he deserves for stealing the boat. What's my evidence for that? Well, for Storm on the Island, it's quite simple. I would just simply talk about the colloquial language used, such as, you know what I mean. As you see, there are no stacks or stooks. This is casual language, this is chatty language, shall we say, and it implies a sense of misplaced confidence. This storm will be fine, we'll be okay, no problem. Certainly as the language becomes slightly more violent towards the end, we come to realise that in fact that confidence is misplaced. You should not have been so confident, Mr. Heaney. And we get a sense of not so much misplaced confidence, but we're rather, shall we say, shocked at Wordsworth's overconfidence. His slight, I hate to use the word arrogance, let's instead use the word conceit. He's rather conceited in how he feels entitled and able to steal this boat that does not belong to him. The use of the verb unloosed, when we hear how I unloosed her chain, implies a certain sense of indulgence. He's really enjoying this. It has not been loosed for a reason, and the fact that you unloosed it implies you're really enjoying freeing this boat that should be enjoyed, even though it's not yours. He claims that he's led by Mother Nature, led by her, implying in brackets that he sort of knows this is a mistake, but he's going to carry on doing it. I was led along. I was, coerced into doing this by other people. But I think the really good one is the oxymoron that you can use for this point. He knows that it is an act of troubled pleasure. The oxymoron here implying an internal emotional conflict. He knows what he's doing is wrong, stealing this boat, but he's going to do it anyway because it's slightly enjoyable. So I think that oxymoron there is a really good one because it really does show it's a complex sentence, as we said. Oxymorons are complex sentence structures. And so we're rather pleased by the end, I'm suggesting, that what he knows to be wrong is something that eventually comes to haunt him. We obviously don't hate Wordsworth, he's a wonderful poet, but in order to try and find a compelling comparison with Storm on the Island, you may wish to consider that one. And the final paragraph of today, guys, is all to do with religion. Religion and time and nature are themes that come up in all of these poems. And all we've done here, everybody, is try and find something about religion that we can compare with two poems. So we might finish off as follows, everybody. Whereas Storm on the Island perhaps presents a more questionable understanding of the role of religion in one's life. In the Prelude, a very real fear of its absence is presented because of the power of nature. So everybody, I've noticed that there is religion in both poems. I want to talk about them both, and effectively I'm going to say that the violence of the storm you could perhaps suggest is a metaphor for religion in his life. He claims that this storm is perhaps, isn't that strange? It's a huge nothing we fear. I can't touch this storm. I can't, to some extent, see the storm. I can see the effects of the storm. It's a nothing. It's a huge nothing. And I'm very sort of wary of it. I'm suggesting to everybody that because of where this poem is set, the country in which it is set, and the more recent history of it in the 1970s might imply that he is questioning the tenets of religion. He finds it strange that this huge presence within his life is something that can perhaps cause it to have a great deal of tumult. This, I think, is slightly different from the Prelude, where we have an absolutely key line for any any essay on religion, which I think is really worth writing about. It's worth noticing that the personified mountain in the Prelude towered up between me and the stars. So on one hand, the use of the verb towered implies a terrifying, overbearing entity that literally looms above him and that he cannot necessarily escape the shadow of. But the fact that it comes between me and the stars suggests, as it says on the screen, everybody, that his act of theft seems to lead to a scenario where he literally has access to heaven blocked. Stealing this boat has led him to have his access and his view of the stars taken away from him. He can no longer see the stars. He can therefore, by implication, no longer see heaven. Why? Because this enormous mountain peak is looming up between him and it. And I think that's a really clever thing to say. I hope, at least, it is a clever thing to say, whereby you can talk about how one of the reasons why he's so mentally tormented at the end is he has broken one of the 10 commandments. Thou shalt not steal. And the significance and the weight of not having any forgiveness from God as a result of this is perhaps heavily implied in the idea that the mountain acts as a sudden barrier between him and heaven. That, I hope, is a relatively good one to finish off on. Bye for now.